Okay. Well, we'll wait just a few more minutes. I've got 2 minutes after, but we'll wait to see if we get a couple more people.
So I was at the half price bookstore, and there's what I got.
Great. Oh, great. Oh, and you can see how helpful it is.
$8. Yeah. Yeah. I looked it up. One of the things that I have found is finding history. You're forced to learn a little history. And
Yes.
so, when you were talking about that, I just looked at it briefly in the store and then bought it and brought it home. And the counties, how the counties change, because I'm looking at births in certain counties back in Virginia in the
Yes.
late 1700s. And then in there it tells when certain counties started, when it's subdivided, the year into what other county, and when that county subdivided into other counties. So it's I've had to do that before on the internet, and so this is a whole lot easier and
Yeah.
concise if it's there. I could see that could be a big advantage. Same
Good.
thing with like the states. When Kentucky became a state, and I had one in Virginia that should have been in West Virginia. Well, Virginia was
Mhm.
still hadn't split into Virginia, West Virginia, and so there's like you end up doing history lessons, brief history lessons,
You
in
do.
trying
You
to
do.
solve problems, and that's fun. I've enjoyed that. So
Well, and it also you mentioned, Ted, that you learn the history of a county. It also gives you clues as to, for instance, if the county stays the same or it subdivides because it's getting larger, there's more settlers, there's more residents, which tells you then that there's more likelihood of having written histories or having um, more records at a county courthouse, etc. So it
yeah,
gives you vital clues about how many, for instance, there will be more churches, there will be more denominations, and the more churches you have, the more access you have to records that might be held by that particular church.
yeah,
So or temple, or synagogue. So uh, that's it's interesting. Oh, there's Mary Frances. Hello, welcome. Okay. Well, I think it looks like almost everyone's here except David, and we will go ahead and get started. Welcome. I'll start out today. We are going to start in on looking at all of the different records that you can search for. And Ted just shared that he had found that it looks like a newer version of the handy book for genealogists.
yeah,
And that is extremely helpful because it has all the county maps and all the dates of when a county stopped being that particular county and maybe was subdivided into two counties and gained a new name. And you'll find that sometimes when I first started looking through censuses and I was following a family, I found, for instance, in North Dakota, that the family lived in Grant County in 1900, but by 1910 they were in Morton County. And at the time, I didn't realize that that was an example of a county being subdivided into two, and that Morton County was actually Grant County 10 years before. So they had not moved. They had the same farmland, but to my kind of inexperienced eye, it looked like the family had moved. Normally, if families own farms or they have homesteads, they're probably not going to move unless they are, I want to say, somewhat well to do and can gain maybe better farmland, so they sell their farm and they move to something that has better grazing rights or farm ways to raise wheat or rye, etc. So keep in mind that you may be looking at that. But anyway, all right. Last time we talked about the timeline where you draw a straight line with one ancestor and you start with the birth and you put in an estimate of their death. You may not know, and you use the children as anchors. And that is if, you have somebody born in 1840 and they have a child in 1865, that child then is an anchor, and you probably have, if you have the birth on that child, the censuses tell you where everyone is born. For instance, if you have a Thomas Shute and his parents are born in Virginia, maybe he is born in Massachusetts. Now, keep in mind that sometimes the census takers could get lazy and they could just assume or put down the wrong places of birth. So what you want to do is you want to check various censuses and see, was Thomas Shute's son really born in Massachusetts? 10 years later, is he born in Massachusetts? 10 years after that, is he still born in Massachusetts? And that will give you an idea. But what it will tell you, if you use children as anchors, it will tell you when the people moved. Like, for instance, if their three youngest children are born in Iowa, then they moved to Iowa prior to 1870. And so that gives you an anchor. You can also look at Find a Grave to see if maybe they have a death, a tombstone in a cemetery, and you can get the place where they died. Find a Grave is great. I would encourage you all to register for that, go in and check it and use it. And remember that sometimes people were taken back to a family plot, or they wanted to be buried by a first wife. So it's not uncommon for bodies to be transported. With women, it's sometimes different. They may remarry and be taken back to be buried with the first husband, or maybe some younger children that have died, or they get buried with their second husband in a totally different place. So keep that in mind. Also, the other thing about a timeline is that divorce was not very common in the 1880s through, say, 1920. And oftentimes couples never divorced, they just separated. And so you may find a woman, say, in 1910, 1920, with her children. And it might say in the census that she's widowed, but you know good and well her husband is alive in another state. So oftentimes either the census taker assumed the woman was widowed, or she was widowed in that town. She was widowed as a way of not saying that she was divorced. Until about the 1920s, you really don't see D as marital status, as divorce. The women just did not admit it. One of the things that I have found oftentimes is, particularly if a family was solidly middle class, if a couple separated, the woman often went off to school with the older children. For instance, if they were in a town where they sent their daughters to some academy or some finishing school, say in Minnesota, the wife went to Minnesota and lived there. And it was that, she was just attending her daughter's school, but she was actually separated from the husband and usually never came back. So keep that in mind if you see a mother-in-law living with a family that she may be a true widow, or she may just have left the family unit. And remember that when alcoholism was so high back in the end of the 19th century, that you had no recourse. I mean, if a woman wanted to leave because of untreated alcoholism, she normally did. Okay, any questions? And before we get too much farther, I want to check in with you all and see if you've made any inroads. Jerry, I'll start with you, and you're muted. You're muted.
No, my dog still won't listen to me. I am employing an individual trainer and trying additional approach besides classes, but no, I am enjoying it a lot, Mary, and it's fascinating. The things you bring up. It's just like I was thinking, like the nicknames. Is there something like a thesaurus or something that says? I assume there's a resource that connects nicknames or potential actual names with nicknames.
You might want to look on Cindy's list. That's SYNDIS list. And she sometimes has things on different names. Now, I know that, for instance, she has, like, if you're researching Polish names, she has the like Stanislaus is usually changed into Stanley. But she might have something on nicknames. And the nicknames also vary. For instance, in the revolutionary times, it was very common for a Mary to be called Polly or Molly, but Molly is also a nickname for Margaret at times. Meg is a nickname for Margaret. Elizabeth is usually Liz, Lily. Sometimes it could be Beth. So all of those names vary. And, I haven't looked at Cindy's list recently, but my guess, if anyone would have a list of nicknames and diminutives, that she would have it. And again, it makes a difference if you're looking at American names or if you are looking at foreign names.
No easy answers.
What?
No easy answers. It's like I go back to, my mom's comment once. I remember someone named their child, said, well, what do you call it? And Elizabeth. The people, well, they spent all this time to come up with a name. You call them Elizabeth, It's true that it seems like we have a penchant for coming up with or thinking that everybody needs to be called not their regular name, but a nickname. So
yes. And remember what I said about, as when you look in the 1900 census, a woman's name might be different than it was earlier, because 1900 was the new century and people wanted to be modern. So they might take an old-fashioned name or a biblical name and a woman would change it. My husband's grandmother was named Olive, and by 1920 she's Olivia, which is a much prettier name, but she was baptized Olive, which, obviously she didn't like. So the old-fashioned names and biblical names often get changed or shortened. You'll see a lot of Dotties. You'll see a lot of Millies for Mildred. Gladys usually gets changed. Gladys was a kind of a popular name in the 1920s and 30s, but by 1940, it was kind of old-fashioned. So think about the name that you've seen first, and then think about how it could be changed or shortened. Letty is often a name for Letitia. So just think about those particular names and think how they can be shortened, and you might see it in the census. Okay, Ted.
Well, let's see. I told you I got that book. Here's another interesting. When I was at the Half Price bookstore, here was a book that I just happened to see. They had 2 shelves for genealogy, and it says Abstract for Wills and Inventories of Administration of Accounts of Loudoun County, Virginia, 1757 to 1800. Well, what a weird little book. $3.99 to buy it. But I remembered Loudoun County, and because I've been building my tree, and I started doing my wife's tree, I recognized that name. So I thought, well, I'll just go ahead and buy this book for $3.99. So then I got home and started looking, and sure enough, I've got a bunch of names, and it's in the Lewis side of my family. And of course, this is an abstract, so it doesn't really give the detail of the wills and everything. But I guess my point being, I just happened to stumble upon this for $3.99. You know, what a very limited amount of information. But when I go to the name index, I find 2 or 3 different family names back there. So it probably is going to give me some clues that I might be able to go, and I'll have some specific wills to look at if I can find them, like at the Genealogy Center or somewhere like that.
Yeah. Uh, and I think what Ted is pointing out is that's the type of book that is published by usually a genealogical society in that particular county. And they do, they do a very specific, narrow area. And that's your best bet. Ancestry has a lot of wills on, they've got a nice index to wills. And you're probably better off, like Ted is searching for Eastern states. And of course, those wills are later. And, but you might be able to find that in Ancestry on their database. And then Ted is pointing out that the Midwest Genealogical Library may have a particular book that would just be wills with all of the data. An abstract just gives you the title and the dates.
Yeah.
And so you'll find lots of genealogical societies back in even in the 1880s, 1900s, when genealogy was very popular, will do just that very narrow sphere. I have one that is an abstract of newspaper articles from Thompson County, New York. Now, Thompson County takes over Ithaca, which is where my husband's Irish family's from. And I found probably 25 references in there to marriages, to babies, etc., on his family. Now I have to go, those are newspaper clippings, but it gets you in the area to look for the actual births, etc. So,
yeah, and wills are really, I found wills are really pretty informative.
yes.
And so it's just amazing. I'm telling the new people, it's amazing. I'm just amazed at how much information has been digitized and indexed.
Yes.
It's so much. It's got to be a million times easier to do this than when you were doing it yourself, early on.
Yes.
I would have never had the patience to do it, but I wouldn't, there's no doubt.
Well, before the era of computerized records, there was no alternative. So.
No, and if I could throw just a little information too about Find a Grave. You mentioned Find a Grave, and just for the new people, it appears that almost every cemetery in the country, volunteers have gone out and taken a picture of every tombstone. And then if somebody has done the tombstone and they see a tombstone, then individuals can go in and put some family history on that. Now you have to take that with a grain of salt, but at the bottom of the thing for that particular tombstone and person, it will show who did it.
Yes.
But sometimes you can get some pretty good family history. So, yeah. I mean, it doesn't have to be a metropolitan area. It's out in the country, and people have put this on this Find a Grave just by a volunteer taking pictures and entering it, and taking pictures and entering. It's amazing what Find a Grave has.
And I would say that Find a Grave probably uses ancestry and county histories to do the research. And you can also be a volunteer for Find a Grave, because if I'm researching somebody and I come up with, say, an actual birthplace with the city and town, I'll go into Find a Grave and put it in just to enlarge that. Or I often put in women's maiden names. And so, or I will correct something. If somebody says they were born in Indiana and I know they were born in Kariski, Poland, I will go in and I will suggest that as an edit, and then I'll put my source that I found this out from, etc. And so I think that, like Ted points out, it could be wrong. They could be making some assumptions, but for the most part, they're pretty serious genealogists that do that. And sometimes they will have pictures that you can't find other places. I have looked on Ancestry sometimes for pictures, photos of people, and boom, I run across it on Find a Grave. So that means that they probably came either from a family history or that they came from maybe a county history. And a lot of county historical societies have big bins of photos that they don't post anywhere. They just own them. And if you write to them, they will usually scan one for you for no charge and send it to you. So I think that that's where a lot of the Find a Grave people get the photos that are unpublished. And you can also, another place that you can look for photos, we'll get to that later, is Dead Fred. Dead Fred is a, I always love that, is a photo site that has pictures. And so, I've had good luck with that as well. So, okay, well, thank you, Ted. Very good. Okay. Oh, and I was going to say with your wills, I had a great grandfather, and he was he was illiterate, and I really did not think he'd have a will, but he did, in Minnesota, Rice County, Minnesota. And in his will, he gave his farmland to one of his sons, and it was in exchange for taking him to church every Sunday and running errands for him to get groceries. And so that was the trade-off. Well, that's really interesting, because you look at that and say, okay, so until he dies, this is the bond that they had, and it was legal. So I thought that was very interesting family dynamics. I had looked up a will for one of my friends, and in the will, this father said to the daughter and the son-in-law, if you persist in staying in the Catholic faith, you are out of this will and will get nothing from me except bad wishes. However, if you change over to this particular church, I will give you this portion of land, and etc. So again, the family dynamics there are that father felt so strongly about his church that he, wanted these alien Catholics to give up their faith. So that was interesting. Okay, Nancy, and you need to unmute.
Well, my daughter's been just ripping through all this. And so she has found through Facebook, she's made contact through people on what would be my father's side. So she had an hour-long phone call with them, with people that would be two of my half-sisters. And so they've all bonded. They're all like best friends now, and they want us to come visit. They live in the state of Washington, close to Portland. So yeah, so she's she's done all this. I really can't even wrap my head around this yet. But one concrete thing here on, like, probably the daughter had made a Facebook page for him, and it said he went to Shawnee Mission High School. And we knew when he was born, so we could kind of figure out what year it would be. Well, she has since, learned exactly what year from the daughter. So I went to Johnson County Library, and you can't get anything in there because they're doing renovations. But she sent me to a website, jocohistory.org.
Oh, okay.
And so then it has all kinds of stuff, and it has the yearbooks for Shawnee Mission High School. So Shawnee Mission High School before it was North, and then when it became North, and then all the other ones as they were built. So then I was able to drill down through that and find the 1951 yearbook and find a picture, his senior high school picture.
Wow, that is great.
Yeah, so it's just, yeah, I can't even absorb all this. And of course, other than that, she has all the information, and I'll be visiting her. She'll be here in a month or two. I don't think I commented last week when you were talking about the German immigrants to Russia.
Yes.
So on the mother's side, and she hasn't investigated this as much, except in Ancestry DNA, a name Wittig, I think it's Wittig, kept showing up, and that's German.
Yes.
But then when she looked up something, people that would be my, I don't know whether it would be my grandparents or my great grandparents, it said they were born in Russia, only they had that name.
Yes.
And she doesn't have a city in Russia. And she looked at some things, and I don't know if this is the one where the years might have been different. But then when you explained that there were German immigrants that went to Russia,
Yes.
that was amazing, because that could explain why these people with very German name, it says they were born in Russia.
Yes.
And then on the Ancestry DNA, it didn't show that I had any Russian or Slavic ancestry. I only had German. Well, yeah, German or Northern European. So that was really interesting that you gave us that information.
Yes. So
there's more for her to do there.
And it would also make sense depending on when they immigrated, because it was, you know, when I said that Nicholas I threw them out of Russia, that's when they came to the United States in the around the 1860s through the 1870s, 1880s. And there was also a big push for German immigration. And so they're called Black Sea Russians. And they were very they were very wanted because they spoke German. They broke into both Catholic and Protestant, but they were farmers. And for the reformers of the immigration societies, they did not consider Germans to drink. And so you remember, Prohibition was a big social movement then. So they thought that they were sturdy and sober and would work the fields and, you know, do farm work and you know, take out homestead land. So they really liked the Germans. So if they were from Russia, you might check out some of the towns around the Black Sea area. There's also a society that you can join for free called Black Sea Russians.
Oh, okay.
I think .org, and they've got a lot of information on that. And you're absolutely right that Wittig is a good German name. And so anyway, so that might explain, you know, where your people are from. Yeah.
Also, would they add that the borders might have changed back in there, and so what we think of as Russia or Germany today,
Well,
in Poland.
Well, the Black Sea Russians were actually from a particular region in Russia, that they were sent there to settle, and they really could not move out of that area because they were given land by the Tsar. So that for the most part, they didn't immigrate out of Russia to other Russian areas. They stayed in their kind of family groups. But when they immigrated largely as groups, and their entire towns where, you know, the whole Russian, you know, they had to get out of Russia. Now, some of them went back to Germany, but the majority of them, Germany was not a good place to go to in the 1880s. You know, they were constantly at war. They were conscripting young sons to be soldiers. And so for most people, with the idea after 1862 of free homestead land came to the US. So the majority of them are here.
Yeah, she found that some of relatives who maybe were brothers of my direct grandparents or great grandparents, she had something that they were in Berlin later.
Oh, really? Okay.
So that made me feel more sure that they were really German, because it was confusing that they were German, but yet they were in Russia, born in Russia. And then another thing, and this may not be of interest to anyone else, but then my daughter just sent me the title of a book called The Lost Family how DNA testing is uncovering secrets, reuniting relatives, and upending who we are. And it's by Libby Copeland.
Sounds good.
Copeland. So of course she just sent that, and I haven't seen the book, but apparently we're going to be reuniting with my relatives. I can't even wrap my head around this.
Well, I think it'll take some time to get used to that. I mean, most people don't have instant families that all of a sudden, and that's really what you have. So I think with more time to kind of percolate, I think that it will get easier, but it is a lot to comprehend. Yeah.
Mhm.
I see. Okay, thank you. All right, Mary Frances, you need to unmute.
Hi. Well, last week when my computer stopped, it not only stopped, it actually crashed.
Oh, no.
It's dead. So I'm on my phone again. So no, I haven't gotten a new computer yet, but that's my goal this week, to get myself a new computer. And so I haven't really done anything because I don't like researching on my phone. No, and also my daughter is having a baby a week from Friday, this Friday. So I'm also kind of busy with helping her, with setting up everything. She's moving. There's a lot going on.
Sounds like it. Well,
She just bought a
congrats.
house. So it's a crazy time right now. But I hope next week I will have a computer that I can join you on, and also maybe I'll be able to get a little bit of work done on this. But anyway, I'm still enjoying it very much, and I'm taking good notes on everything you're saying. So
Okay. Well, thank you for that update. Okay.
you're welcome.
All right. Okay. I'm going to go to share screen so I can go into. Okay. And remember, we mentioned the timeline, and you do this timeline on all of your ancestors because it helps you to look for records, to look for pivotal moments in their lives. For instance, if you have somebody that is born in 1840, etc., in the U.S., he would be of age to be in the Civil War. So you might want to look for Civil War records on that particular person. And remember that in the Civil War, you did not have to be young to fight. You could be in your 40s through your 60s. In my sister's married family, I found a 20-year-old, really interesting that my brother-in-law died, and I went back to Canton, Illinois to see to go to his funeral. And there was a Civil War marker for his grandfather that I knew about. I knew his grandfather, Perry Wells, had served in the Civil War for Illinois. But right next to him was a Civil War marker for his own father, who had served in the same unit. And I did not assume that his father would have served because he was already in his late 60s during the Civil War. So I assumed he was not a soldier. So in one trip to a cemetery, I got more information. And later on, when I researched it, it turned out that the older father was the wagon master. So he didn't actually fight in battles, but he did kind of an auxiliary type of soldiering. So anyway, so that and I was able to look up their records. The Civil War records are usually very good, that each state has a muster roll of the particular units. And you can also go online and you will find that a lot of historians or amateur or genealogists have these websites for the particular units. It might be the 17th Indiana Artillery, and they will have a unit and try to do muster rolls. And then there are also some books that are at the genealogical library, and they are the history of the Union Civil War. There's also a Confederate series, and it has it has the Civil War day by day. So if you want to know where a particular unit was serving, and you can't find that online or in one of the state histories, you can go to these books and look up where, you know, they were, and it gives you an interesting you know, battle history, where they were, where they were moved to, what they did. They do sentry duty? Did they guard a bridge? Were they in a battle? And I was, you know, I have a Civil War ancestor on my Corcoran side, and he was in every major battle of the Civil War, you know, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville, Antietam, just all the Fredericksburg, all of the bloody battles of the Civil War, and was never injured. And my husband claims that that's because it's hard to get shot when you're hiding behind a tree. But but he did make it through unscathed. But it's just interesting to think about that you know, that probably for the rest of his life he was very honored for all of that service at the really critical battles. And sometimes people find that their ancestors were there at where, for instance, Lee surrendered at the courthouse, and so they're, you know, so they were there watching it probably. So that's a kind of an interesting timeline. Okay, let's look at some of the sources. There are colonial, territorial, and state census records. And someone pointed out that last time that there are state censuses, and they took those in the off years. The censuses are every 10 years, and the state got money from the federal government to do an in-between census. So there might, if there's a 1900 census, federal census, then in 1905, there might be a state census. 1915 might be another state census, 5 years after the 1910 federal. So a lot of colonial, territorial, or state census records are there, which gives you a, you know, in between. Now keep in mind that a lot can happen in 10 years. There is a gap in the census records from 1880 to 1900. There's a 20-year gap. You know how you always hear that the records burned up? Well, in this case, they really did. The 1890 census burned up, and the only ones that are fragmentary or still exist are the ones where a state kept a copy of their own federal census. And that was not very common. They usually sent, because we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of pages, and there were no copying methods at that point. So when the census takers took all the census from the state, it was gone. So the only thing that really existed, only because they lasted 1 or 2 pages, were the 1890 federal veteran census. And that is that each county took a federal census in 1890 of all their, and they were then Civil War veterans, and they were still alive. And these are wonderful because they give the unit in which they served. It doesn't matter where it was. It might be Massachusetts, it might be Colorado, it might be Illinois, and they're living in Indiana, but they still are in the 1890 veteran census. And it gives the day they enlisted with dates and the day they came out. So it gives you their exact service. So you can tell if they, you know, were there for a year or they were there for a very short time. And then it also gives an amendum on their injuries. And this is very important because when people applied for their pensions, you know, it will give you a record of, you know, were they injured in battle? Did they have gunshot wounds? Did they lose an eye? Did they have rheumatism or dropsy, or which was palsy? as a result. They have kidney problems as a result of the Civil War. So that will all be at the bottom of the 1890 census. Okay. State land records. Remember that in 1862, President Lincoln signed the Homestead Act and gave free homestead land to anyone over the age of 21 who was male or female. But if they were female, they had to be single. They could not be a married woman. And so for a filing fee, which usually cost about $5 to $14 at your county land office, you could take out your homestead land. And you had to prove out your land, and that meant that you had to live on it for 5 years, and you had to make improvements such as a well, building a barn, and you had to live there continuously for 3 years to prove it out. Now, everyone built a little homestead shack, and they were usually, they were not, sometimes not much bigger than chicken coops. They had to be a specific size, and they made them oftentimes out of sod or leftover lumber, etc. And they supposedly had to live there continuously, making improvements on the land. Well, I don't think that people really did live there continuously. I think that they had their homestead lands, and I think that they spent time out there. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing and it won't shut up. I think that, for instance, I had a grandmother who had homestead land, and I really doubt that she was living in her homestead shack on the land. I feel much more likely that she was living in a nice, comfortable house in town, and that she got her neighbors to claim that she was on her homestead land. And I think that this was fairly common. Now, in around the end of the 1890s, a lot more women were taking out land. And what they did is that they got their friends to get land very close to them, and they built their little homestead shacks, and someone built a bigger, like a cabin, 2-room cabin, and they would all live in the 2-room cabin, but they would keep their little homestead shacks close by so that they could claim that they lived there. But the women out on the prairie alone, did not want to be alone at night, etc. So they all banded together. So this was a fairly common thing. Okay. Revolutionary or bounty land warrants. During the Revolutionary War, the government did not have money to pay bounties, and that is that they had to lure people into serving by offering them something. And so what they did was they gave them bounty land warrants on public land. Now, if you've got Revolutionary War ancestors in the original 13 colonies, the land in the 13 colonies was usually taken. So the public land would be in a state like Kentucky or Georgia or Mississippi, which were public lands. And so it's not uncommon to find that you may have somebody that served, say, in Virginia, and their bounty land warrant was in Georgia. So that meant that to collect it, they had to go and live on that land and farm it. So you often see Revolutionary War families that have their origins in New Jersey or New York or Virginia or etc. All of a sudden, they're in the southern states. And it's usually because of those bounties, those land warrants. And you can look those up at the University of Virginia. They've got a great website for the Revolutionary or bounty land warrants. And you can look up and to see where the land is. Tax rolls. A lot of states have particular tax rolls where you can track where somebody has paid taxes. The southern states are really great for the tax rolls. So are the original 13 colonies. And again, year by year that tells you where your ancestor is, what county they were in, where they were paying taxes. The state militia rolls and records, again, remember that the state militia existed not just in times of war, but in other times. And just like we have a National Guard now, so it might be that your particular relative enrolled in the state militia and maybe was attached to a company, and there's some records there. There are also records of pay warrants. And again, you know, if you are looking to see if your relative was in a particular war, that maybe there is a pay warrant for the Civil War or the Indian Wars or the French and Indian Wars. Okay. Some other censuses. Is there anyone in the class that thinks that they have Native American ancestry? Anyone? Okay. Didn't see. No one. Okay. One of the issues. I'm sorry. One of the issues is many Americans feel that they have Native American ancestry. So if you are looking for, or you run across people that are Native American, there are the U.S. Indian Census rolls. 1885, and I've got to change this, they go into the 1940s, and they are a federal census. And those censuses were taken every single year if they are on a reservation. And so that's wonderful because you can, you know, get very close to people being born and died and find children that did not live past, you know, toddlerhood, etc. Also in the federal census, 1880, Washington, Oregon, California, and the Dakota Territory are all good sources for Native Americans. There are the Dawes rolls, and those are the 5 civilized tribes. And you've heard a lot of probably chatter about Andrew Jackson. Well, Andrew Jackson was the one, the president who broke up the tribes and almost created what they call the 5 civilized tribes. And the 5 civilized tribes are the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole. And those are the ones that were taken off of their lands, for instance, the Seminoles in Florida, and marched to reservations. And so that means that the ones, for instance, the Cherokees were very acclimated. They had land, they lived in houses, etc. And very wealthy people wanted their land and wanted their houses. And so when Jackson bowed to political pressure to get them all on reservations, all that housing and land and farmland and businesses were available for other people to take. A very, very shameful chapter in American history, but it again goes back to how the 5 civilized tribes were created out of that group of people. And they are on what they call the Dawes rolls, and they are people that are enrolled in those particular tribes. And they were one of the first groups of tribes to be enrolled in a federal program because they were getting benefits. The Seminoles were the only tribe who kept slaves. So if you, and they were called Black Indians. And so if you are doing any kind of African-American ancestry, you will also want to look at the Dawes rolls to find Black Indians that are listed under the Seminoles. And of course, those family, you know, they intermarried with Black Indians. And so Seminoles often have African-American ancestry that goes back to the Congo and Cameroon and Mali and Bantu, etc. So anyway, slave schedules. It's not uncommon for people to come up with African-American ancestry in their trees. And if you are trying to research this, there are slave schedules dating from 1820, 1830, 1840, 1850, and 1860. Now, the slave schedules do not have names. They only are, slash marks, a black male from say 15 to 20, a child under 5, etc. So all you will find is male and female and age groups. But the 1870 U.S. Census, this is the gold mine for African American research because it is only 5 years after the end of the Civil War. So that means that all of the people, all the African Americans that are in the 1870 census were formerly enslaved people. So that's where you will find the last names. The other thing I would encourage you to do if you're looking for them, that in the 1870s, there was a lot of newspaper ads where families wanted to reunite. So if you go through Chronicling America or newspapers.com, you can find the various ads for enslaved families looking for family members. And that will give you a lot of information, such as, I'm looking for Hetty, who was on the John Buchanan plantation in Delta, Mississippi. And so it'll give you a lot of particular information. And I've had a lot of African-American researchers find that those ads are, very, very important. There's also a book, looking for family, about African-American research, exactly on those particular ads. And those ads ran sometimes for 20 years, which was really very sad that 20 years later, people were still looking for far-flung relatives that had been sold away from plantations. So anyway, and the other thing for African-American research is that often that you can look for large slave owners in the area where you are looking to try to get a clue as to last names. And people did not always take the name of their last owner. They might have taken the name of an owner that they have liked, or they might have made up a name like Washington or Jefferson or Lincoln or etc. But if you see a name, I would also look in the 1870 census for large slave owners that reported in the slave schedules in 1860. And you'll get a clue as to who might have enslaved them and emancipated them. Okay. And also wills are a good source that oftentimes people emancipated their slaves in their wills, and they will list the particular enslaved people by name. I am emancipating Bessie and her son, etc. So look for particular wills that in those countries, in those counties. Okay. The South has Confederate records, and when I mentioned that they have the books that have the Civil War day by day of the Confederate records, there's also a set of books that the Midwest Genealogical Library has. And so if you have Southern soldiers, you will find those records there. Okay. Next one. All right. Okay. There's vital statistics, birth, death at the state level. And years ago, people used to like to get the birth certificates and death certificates of all of their relatives to have. Well, unless they're online for free, this is getting extremely expensive. And most states have gone over to VitalCheck. And last I checked, I think it was up to $75 to get a birth or death certificate. Missouri is lucky that all the records are digitalized, and so you can download them for free and get birth and death and marriage records on Missouri Digital Records. Thanks to Gene Carnahan, our Secretary of State 20 years ago. But for the most part, you're going to have to rely on something like Ancestry to get those particular records. If somebody is born in a very tiny county somewhere, you might have some success in going online and seeing if the county provides those records for a small fee. I think I have gotten records out of Montana for something like, oh, I want to say $3 a record, and it's just all by mail. And so I've ordered some records like that just because I was interested in the particular cause of death on someone. And so I wanted to see the record, the actual record. And that's what I did. The marriage, birth, and death are usually held by the county. At some point, sometimes the county sends them all over to a larger county. So you've got to check on that. Family and business papers might be held by the state archives. And particularly if your family had a business that was well known in the particular state. You also might go back if your family worked for a national organization or one that had a religious orientation. You might go back to the records held by that particular religion and see if they've got some archives that you could either visit or that you could write to their particular archivist to see if there's anything there. For instance, my father was a USO director, and there's very, very little history in Kansas City on the USO, which was here for probably 60 years. And if you go down Main Street, you see these big car dealerships at 3200 Main. Well, that was where the USO was. It was a great big 3-story stone mansion, and it stood there for a number of years right there. It's across from Gates Barbecue. And but when you go to research the USO in Kansas City, the records are not here at all. So in that case, I have to go to the national organization to see if they've got anything on the Kansas City organization. I'm researching my dad's job. The colonial government and Revolutionary War records were transferred back to the states. Remember, those were federal records, but most states own them. So you will find different archives, and you will also, people are really interested in the Revolutionary War records. Remember that the sons of the Revolution, the sons of the American Revolution, and the daughters of the American Revolution are very old societies, not-for-profit societies that are historical societies that ask you to send in your information to register to become a son of the American Revolution or daughters of the American Revolution. And, people used to see these as, kind of snobby societies because you were trying to prove back to your Revolutionary War ancestors. But what they were instead they were historical societies that created a database for all the Revolutionary War soldiers and their families. So Ancestry has the applications on file. Now, what you might find is that the application, say, is from somebody on the other side of the family, that this might be your relative, but maybe it's the maternal side of the family, and that's a grandson that applied for it in 1932, and there is his application. So some of his data may be different from yours because of his descendancy, but when you get back to the Revolutionary War soldier, it should be the same for a couple of generations. Then it will split off because, as I've said, he's not your direct line. He's maybe a nephew on the mother's side. Do you understand that? Yeah, Ted?
Do you feel comfortable in that then? Because I have found that a number of times where it's been like 2, 3, or 4 generations up before we have a common ancestor. But are you comfortable with the results if it's been approved by the DAR or SAR?
Yes, because the DAR has a huge database and you can access their library for free. They've got the DAR has a wonderful library that you can access. Yes, because they are sitting on so many family histories and genealogies that they have to trace all of those genealogies to make certain that somebody is a direct descendant. So I would say yes. I've unless you're just flat out lying about your ancestors and you got the dates, I would say that they back them up. And I know that they've turned down people because the people could not show the direct descendant. And you know, you figure if you did this in say 1940, the records weren't there. You know, we're talking again about the courthouse records, and microfiche wasn't even existing. So their records, I would say, are very, very good. And I'm sure that they've got genealogists that go in and correct mistakes in family histories, and you know, do data. So I would say I would trust the DAR and the Sons of the American Revolution. Uh, but again, so that's very nice to be able to do that. In the Western states, you're going to have cattle brand registrations. And this is just kind of fun. If you had some Western cowboys that were cattle ranchers or raised cattle, you can find where they registered their brand. In the small towns, they printed cattle brands every week. And that is, once you registered your brand, you wanted it in the paper on a regular basis in case your cattle strayed. So if you know, had the Lazy Anchor brand, they would have a picture of a drawing of a cattle, and they would show where the brand was. Was it on the ear? Was it on the left flank? Was it, you know, etc. And so you can find those particular cattle brands. I'm still looking for my great grandfather's cattle brand because he raised cattle in North Dakota, and when my other grandfather on the other side was a cowboy, and he had, you know, small herds. And then my father and his father got cattle shares. And I think I mentioned that cattle shares are when you feed and take care of a cow over the winter, that you get to keep the calves. Well, my father and his brother got to keep the calves. So they had their own little herd. I mean, it may not have been a huge herd. It might have been, you know, maybe 3 to 5, but they had their own cattle brands when they were children. And so I've been on the search for that, because my Corcoran cousins out in California, of which there are like 120, say, hey, we can have T-shirts, we can have hats with the cattle brands. So I've been searching for those, but I haven't had good luck in finding them yet. Anyway, there are records of state law enforcement, public safety, residential, or correction institutes. Now, you may not be too charmed to find out that, you know, Uncle Leroy, you know, did a stretch at the penitentiary, you know, for armed robbery, but it is helpful, particularly if you can't find people. Sometimes there will be lists of, say, orphanages or even reform schools, etc. And you might find a relative in there. If somebody's widowed, I mean, somebody's orphaned, it's not uncommon, you know, for them to land up in an orphanage. I found a great uncle, and I found all of his younger children in an orphanage in Iowa. And it turned out that he had died and his widow couldn't do anything. So she gave up all the children temporarily. And so there were, you know, a whole batch of their young children in an Iowa orphanage in a particular census year. And I don't know how long they stayed there, but you know, I knew where they were in 1920. Also, the National Archives has records of the federal penitentiaries, and they have mugshots. So if you're looking for a picture of someone, you may be able to find them in the federal penitentiary mugshots. The southern states did poll tax, and also there's voter registration lists. California has tons of voter registration lists for every year. So you can really narrow down where your people lived in a state as large as California. Okay, I mentioned Cindy's list, surnames, counties, states, all kinds of extraneous information. I think I mentioned before that Cindy has a list of archaic medical terms. And that's really helpful if you're wondering what somebody died of. And my particular example was I found a Canadian death certificate, and it said cause of death fellow de se, which is Latin. And I could not find it, looked it up on Cindy's list, and it is Latin for by their own hand, which means suicide. And so instead of just putting suicide, they put fellow de se. So you can, look up, for instance, Bright's disease is often a cause of death, and that's kidney disease. So it's babies died of summer complaint, and that's actually they died of either diarrhea or they did not dehydration. And at some point there was a point where people didn't think that babies needed to drink water. And so when they got really, really hot and there was no air conditioning, etc., they were just dehydrated, and so many babies died of summer complaint. So that gives you an idea. Also, I was just
Consumption
looking
was one
at,
that you see a lot. Consumption was one.
yes, and consumption is TB.
Mhm.
And also another word for consumption is white plague. So sometimes you'll see that on death certificates. But yeah, consumption is a big one. And that was, with consumption, they did not think it was contagious. So it's very common to see entire families die one by one throughout the years. And some people are stronger, so they live with consumption longer. And I had a great uncle who either had consumption or heart disease. I mean, the symptoms looked about the same. And he had to give up his blacksmithing business when he was 47. So that tells you something. And, blacksmiths need a lot of lung capacity to use the bellows to keep their fires going. And he couldn't do it. He had to sell his business at 47. So that tells you how debilitated he was. And then his daughter died of consumption when she was 24. And so, you think about people living in small cabins or small houses, and, doing things like drying meat or butchering meat or all this kind of stuff. The germs were there that led to consumption. And since they did not realize that it was an airborne disease with the spores, people did not take, many precautions until probably the middle of the early 1900s, maybe 1910, and it's rampant in places like Indian reservations. It was estimated in the 1890s that 5/8 of all Indian tribes had tuberculosis. And so when you see the children die young, they probably had consumption as well. So anyway, okay. You could look at www.rootsweb.com. RootsWeb is a great website and gives you all kinds of information. For maps, look at the Library of Congress map collections from 1500 to 2000. They will have all kinds of maps, and this might help you pin down locations and towns and see where they exist in terms of rivers. And topographical places really don't change very much. So they will be the same for a while. This Sanborn Fire Insurance Maps. The Sanborn Fire Insurance Map started around, I want to say, the late 1870s. And what they did is, you can see from this map, they went in and they mapped all of the structures in case these people took out insurance for fire. And of course, fire was a big thing in cities. And so this is an example of one. I think that this is Bismarck, North Dakota in 1875. But it gives you all of the streets and it gives you all the dwellings that are there. For instance, this is an exhibition building. This is a brewery. These are saloons, and you can see where things are. So if you have some people that were in a city that might have a Sanborn fire insurance maps, you might be able to find the old structures that were there when they lived there. And maybe, you know, as in old cities, you can find where they lived, you know, maybe downtown. And of course, modern cities, you know, they've changed the names. They, you know, put freeways through them, so they don't exist anymore. So if you want to reconstruct where your people lived, go into the Sanborn fire insurance maps and see if they've got a city or a town for your relatives. I think they're just fun to see. I like to look at them. Okay, some more on maps. The GNIS is the Geographic Names Information System, and this is a database of current and historical U.S. places. So you just go in there and see if you can find the little town where your people are from or where they were in the census. Old city maps, streets and numbers change. And for instance, my sister was traveling in Tokyo, and, you know, they don't really have any numbers for houses. People have addresses, but they're not on the houses. And she was in Tokyo and got off the subway, the wrong stop. And she had no idea how to get to where, you know, her son lived. And nobody knew, because his address had no meaning for them, because the streets and everything aren't marked except the major ones. So in old city maps, remember that they may be very different than what they look like now. So that's where you want to look at the Sanborn insurance maps and maybe match them up, or look in an old, for instance, history book, you know, like this is a history of Emmons County, and they have for some of the towns, they have a map that looks like that shows the original town and the major town names. Broad Street and Front Street and Main Street were usually givens in old towns. There's a tutorial on tinyearl.com, historical maps for Google, and then Google Earth search. You can download this for free. I don't know if you have to register for that, but either way, you can look for the Earth maps. I'm always so surprised. I think it was funny that I once downloaded a map of our house, and there was my son mowing the lawn in our house picture. And it's so strange. Okay. Talk about photos. There are ancientfaces.com. I mentioned Dead Fred. This is the largest and oldest photo reunion site, and they try to match you, you know, find photos. The other thing is there is a site called Acts of Genealogical Kindness, and this is a site where people find photos, and they try to reunite them with people. For instance, this is a wonderful family photo, and I bought it for $2 at a store, and it is the Graham family out of Pennsylvania. And sometimes at the bottom you will find the photographer. You can find, yeah, okay. So you can find the photographer across the bottom, the studio. This particular one is in Ottawa, Kansas. And on the back is Uncle Alfred Hornbeck and Laura McDonald. So what you can, you know, what I usually do if I see them, they're cheap enough, I buy them. And then I usually, you know, find them on Ancestry and ask the family if they want that picture. Or I'll post it on Ancestry's Lost Photos or Dead Fred and try to get the photos back to the family. And I've had tremendous luck with this, that on one of the Indiana sites, somebody posted a picture and I realized that the name was my mother's cousin and first cousin. And I got in contact with the person and she said not only did she have that picture, she had 5 more. And they were all my mother's first cousins. And she mailed them all to me. And they were beautiful, beautiful photographs that were taken. And she had bought them and wanted to reunite them. I also found an 1896 photo. And it's about huge. It was about, I want to, about this big. And it was a family group taken somewhere in Missouri. And I was able to figure out the family from the information on the back and reunited it with that family. And they were so excited because they had never seen these people. And here was their entire family, like a group of about 25 people at one point in time. So anyway, so there is a site called Acts of Genealogical Kindness that tries to do favors for people in genealogy. So you can look that up, Acts of Genealogical. And Ancestry.com has photos as well. FamilySearchCenter.org has some photos. And then there is Mass Memories Roadshow that has a lot of digitalized photos. And I don't know if you'd find your actual family in there, but you might find some pictures of towns or structures in the particular town. And I think I mentioned last week that I bought a book a couple weeks ago called Chicago Now and Then. And it's some old historic pictures of Chicago. Well, my mother was a young woman in Chicago. She worked there, and all of those buildings are on the same street where she worked. And so if I do a photo album of my mother, I will use some of these historic buildings. Like this is the train station where she would have left Chicago to go home for the weekend. This is the building which would be across the street from her workplace, etc. So just I kind of picture these grayed out photos as a backdrop, and then maybe put photos of her on top of them, just to give a feeling for where she was in the late 20s, early 30s, and give a feeling for her life. I still have not found a picture of Al Capone's bars in Little Italy, but I'm looking for that because she used to tell me that that's where she and her friends used to go because they had the best liquor there. And she was literally a flapper in the late 20s, early 30s, and went to speakeasies. Along with her work friends. So interesting. Gazetteers. Gazetteers are on different archives, and what they are map-like histories of a particular county, and the big libraries have them. The Midwest Genealogy Library has some big drawers with gazetteers, but those are extremely helpful. I have one on Ireland that I use for the counties, and it shows the very, very tiny villages that will never show up in a guidebook, etc. So gazetteers are helpful. I mentioned atlases, both US and foreign. I think I was stunted in grade school and never really had very good history because I really did not have a good sense of where all these countries were in terms of geography. And so I have to look at an atlas a lot to see where things are. Like I've been to Wales, but I can't picture it on a map where it is in relation to England. I always have to look at a map to see where it is positioned. And the same like with the Scottish Isles, I can't remember where they are in relation to Scotland's coast, even though I've been there. So I rely a lot on atlases to give me a clue. And remember, that when you look at a US atlas, you're looking to see what are the state borders that are very close. Where are the big rivers that would have been used for commerce? Did people go across the state border to get married or to get groceries or to go to church or to visit relatives? I had been researching some people in Tioga, Pennsylvania. And it turns out that that is very, very close to New York. And basically, I found things in the New York papers about these people from Tioga, Pennsylvania. They were back and forth so often. It's not very far. It's maybe 20 miles across the state line. But they visited the New York site so often that they were in the society columns. You know, George Ostrander visited today to visit his sister, etc. And so I learned to expand my newspaper site. But you want to know that. You want to know that. And did people take a paper that was from another state just because that was the paper that got delivered by the mailman, and not one that's farther away on the other side? So keep those state boundaries in line. Okay. Topographical maps, because landforms don't often change. There's a collection at the Library of Congress. And if you're not familiar with the Library of Congress or the National Archives, I would get familiar. They have wonderful resources, and everything, you know, is free, and you can download things and get wonderful photos and images, etc. And they do wonderful, wonderful work. Panorama bird's eye. This is an example of, if you can see this, a panorama bird's eye. And this is of Prairie du Chien, Wisconsin, where my grandmother was born in 1858. And so that's a nice, it's a very old one. It was done in 1870, but it's really beautiful, showing the river. And Prairie du Chien was a big river site where people traded, and various Native Americans came to trade as well. So that's very important. So that's a panoramic bird's eye. And those are, you can look at memory.libraryofcongress.gov, and they have some of those panoramic bird's eyes. You can also buy them on eBay. They will have a panoramic bird's eye of your particular city, and they're ranging anywhere from, you know, I'd say $12 to $20. But you know, you can, if you could download them for cheap, but you use up your ink. So I don't know which is best. There's also demographic maps that show where particular groups are, and those are from the census. So you can go in the www.census.gov at GeoMaps, and they will tell you different demographics of particular people, like if this is farmland, etc. So this is an example of, this is, I don't know if you can see this, this is a Rice County, Minnesota plat map. And a plat map tells you who owns all that land. So every little square is a land owning, and that will allow you to, particularly if your people have homestead land, that will allow you to figure out where it is in relation to the rest of the countryside. There's vintage aerial maps. They have 41 states where they show overall vintage things. I've seen some of them, they're really good, but again, it helps you with topography and landscape. And then go into the US government, Earth Explorer, usg.gov are very, very good for maps. Okay, let's look at some sources for state and country. So the city directories, the genealogical libraries and ancestry have these. The city directories are great because they give the person's address and they give their occupation. And some city directories have women. For instance, you might see Mrs. Thomas Smith in 1918, but you know that Thomas Smith died in 1910, and after her name will be WID for widow. So it may not give her first name. And again, women kept their married names, or if they were widowed a long time, maybe they went over to Mrs. Nancy Smith after a while, but technically a Mrs. Nancy Smith was a divorced woman. And so that's why women kept to their husband's names, because that differentiated you. But if you were an older woman who had been widowed a long time, you may not have cared for the proprieties. You know, you didn't really care if people called you Mrs. Nancy Smith, because you knew good and well you were widowed and not divorced. Again, the county histories. And don't be surprised if you have immigrant people that are not in there, or that your family left a county for a long time earlier. And usually county histories are compiled by the families that stay behind. And they put out a call in the county newspaper and say, do you have a family history and photos? We're publishing a book and we'd like to put it in there. For instance, this huge 700-page book is called Prairie Trials to Highways. And it's all of the histories of people in Burleigh County, which constitutes Bismarck. And I've said that my great-grandfather was a founder of Bismarck. We're not in the book at all. And again, because by the time the book was published, my family was long gone, and no one, they're mentioned occasionally in a family, parenthetically, like somebody said, my great-grandfather was with the first exploration group with Jack Waldron, my grandfather, but that's it, so they're not really in there. I've had to find other sources to document their history in that county. So don't, and if your people are foreign speaking, chances are they may not be in a particular county history. Okay. Genealogical and Historical Society publications. I will put in a big commercial here for joining your local genealogical society where you're researching. Usually the fees are very, very cheap, anywhere from $3 up to $20. And if you join that society, you will get their newsletter either by paper, by mail, or online. And you'll have access. Sometimes they have files that they only let their members access. I just joined the South Bend Genealogical Society in Indiana about 2 weeks ago, and they just sent me my password, and I went into it, and they have 500 immigrant trees that I have not seen very many of them. And I'm researching Polish ancestry, and as you all know, South Beach is a huge treasure trove of Polish families. And so I am going through these genealogies that I have never seen, and many of them are not on Ancestry. And so for $20, it is a great wealth of information, and that covers an entire year. Plus I'm going to get, I think it's like 6 newsletters about what their latest records, etc., baptismal records, church records, etc. So see about joining a genealogical society. Some of them are, better than others, but all of them usually have a historian that is familiar with their records, and you can write to them and ask them if they have anything. Now, I have to say that sometimes, the records can be wrong. I had a grandmother whose name was Clark, and so they attached her to another Clark and said that because he was in the same town that was her brother. Well, he wasn't her brother at all. He was from England. She's from Ireland. But they made that assumption because the name was the same, that they were related. And I corrected that, by sending her them a family tree on her and saying, that they needed to take that out of their records. But anyway, I'm right at the 11:30 mark, so I need to close for today. But before we close, I wanted to ask, are there any questions that I have not covered?
Do you have any information on how to locate federal employee websites, like to find out work records or titles or dates of employment of federal employees? Lots of my family retired, including my dad, my mom, my grandfather, lots of them retired from the federal government. But I don't have their dates of work or their titles.
I don't, unless the records are 72 years old, I don't think those records are going to be available.
Oh.
That the problem with old records like that is that they're archived, and if they worked before things got computerized, anymore people will just HR departments will just verify records. Yes, they did work for us from, etc. But they may not, I don't know. I've never heard of anyone getting those records.
Okay.
And the federal government says that all records, for instance, census data has to be 72 years old before they'll release it. For instance, the 1950 census is released next April because it'll be 72 years old in 2022. I am guessing, having done tons of federal work for all of the various agencies, that you would not get very far with an HR department on wanting somebody's records. So that's a good question. My guess is that they would not release them unless you were an employer, and if the person's already dead, they wouldn't release them, because they would know that they're not looking for a job. So I'm not certain that you could access those.
Okay. All righty.
But I'll try to find out. I'll talk to some of my federal sources. But you could, and I was going to say Social Security records. No, that wouldn't tell you employment. They just tell you when they applied for Social Security. But good question, Mary, for instance. Anyone else? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. And next, our next slide is on federal censuses, everything you wanted to know about federal censuses and how to bore into them. So we will see you next Tuesday, and have a great week.
Thanks. You too. Bye-bye.
Bye now. And thank you, Jerry.